For more than 3 decades, Johnny Carson sat in the same chair, night after night, trapped in a professional situation few people ever truly understood. His job required him to sit inches away from some of Hollywood's most unpredictable personalities, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, and maintaining an unbreakable on-camera composure, no matter what his senses were enduring. Viewers at home saw elegance, timing, and control. What they never saw was the physical reality of those moments once the cameras stopped rolling. The Tonight Show studio, during the 1960s and 1970s, was not the sterile environment we associate with television today. It was a sealed room filled with cigarette smoke, heavy cologne, alcohol-soaked breath, and bodies pressed together under blazing studio lights. Crew members later described it as a kind of celebrity soup, where scents lingered long after guests had left the couch. Carson was not a smoker. He was known to be intensely sensitive to personal space, bodily intrusion, and loss of control. And yet, night after night, he had no option to step away, no right to stand up, no ability to show discomfort. His famous sips of water were not a nervous habit, they were survival. Beneath the desk, his hands would tighten around the chair, while above it, his face never broke. What follows are not punchlines or exaggerated gossip. These are stories NBC executives never wanted discussed. The unseen cost of live television, the unspoken protocols created to protect the host, and the moments when even Johnny Carson's legendary professionalism was pushed to its absolute limit. This is not just a story about unpleasant guests. It is a story about endurance, discipline, and the hidden price of perfection paid quietly, night after night, by the man who made it all look effortless. Bette Davis didn't just enter the Tonight Show studio, she altered it. By the time she reached the couch, the air around her had already thickened, layered with the unmistakable combination of cigarette smoke, stale alcohol, and an overpowering perfume applied not to compliment, but to conceal. The result was not a scent, but a presence heavy, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Davis was a relentless smoker in her later years, and those close to production recalled that the smell clung to her clothing and breath with unusual persistence. The perfume only intensified it, creating a dense chemical mix that seemed to sit in the air rather than dissipate. Under the hot studio lights, that mixture warmed, expanded, and became more aggressive with every passing minute. She also had a habit of leaning in when she spoke. Conversations were conducted at close range, her voice cutting through the haze while the space between her and Johnny Carson steadily disappeared. For a host known to be deeply sensitive to personal boundaries and physical intrusion, this proximity transformed discomfort into endurance. Carson did not shift away. He did not interrupt. He remained perfectly still, breathing shallowly, eyes forward, timing intact. According to a former NBC page, the aftermath of a Davis appearance was immediate and unmistakable. As soon as the cameras stopped rolling, industrial fans were brought onto the set between tapings. The goal was not comfort, it was recovery. The air needed to be moved, diluted, reset before another human being could reasonably sit in the same space. Crew members joked quietly that Davis was the second guest, the one who stayed behind long after she had left the couch. One staffer later recalled that the smell didn't fade, it lingered, embedded in the upholstery, the desk surface, even the host's jacket. On at least one occasion, a guest scheduled to follow her reportedly sat down, paused, and asked with a half-smile, "Bette Davis just left, didn't she?" Johnny Carson never acknowledged the comment. He smiled, adjusted his posture by a fraction, and continued hosting as if the studio were unchanged. The audience saw nothing unusual. What they could not see was a space struggling to breathe again. Bette Davis exited the stage unapologetically, exactly as she lived. What remained behind was invisible to viewers, but unforgettable to the man who had been required to sit inside it. Dean Martin rarely arrived empty-handed. By the time he sat down beside Johnny Carson, the presence of alcohol had already announced itself not sharply, not suddenly, but slowly, heavily, as if the air itself had been soaked and left to warm under the lights. Martin was known for drinking before appearances. What viewers never saw was how that drinking manifested once he reached the couch. The smell was not limited to his breath. According to those who worked nearby, it rose from his skin, from his clothes, from the space immediately around him. It was warm, sweet, sour, and unmistakable, the scent of liquor that had been living inside a body for years. Under the studio lights, that odor intensified. As Martin laughed, gestured, and leaned back, the smell expanded outward in waves. One crew member later described it as sitting beside a glass of bourbon that had been left open too long, thickened by heat and time. It didn't dissipate. It settled. Johnny Carson felt it immediately. He did not react outwardly. He did not shift away. He did what he always did. He held his posture, controlled his breathing, and continued the interview. But those who watched closely noticed the subtle signs. The extra sip of water, the slightly longer pause between questions, the careful maintenance of distance without making it obvious. After one particularly heavy appearance, Carson reportedly joked quietly to Ed McMahon off camera, "I can taste bourbon, and I didn't even drink tonight." The line never reached the audience. On air, Martin remained charming, relaxed, and unbothered. Off-air, the space around the desk required attention. Makeup artists later recalled that after Martin left the couch, the area was wiped down more thoroughly than usual. Not because of spills there were none, but because the smell lingered, clinging to fabric and wood alike. It was not offensive in the conventional sense. It was persistent. And persistence, for someone like Johnny Carson, was far worse. What made Dean Martin difficult was not unpredictability or disrespect. It was saturation. Alcohol that had fully integrated into a body does not announce itself and leave. It stays. And Johnny Carson, bound to his chair, had no choice but to sit inside it until the cameras stopped rolling. Buddy Hackett didn't simply speak, he projected. From the moment he sat down, his presence changed the texture of the space between him and Johnny Carson. He leaned forward instinctively, spoke at close range, and delivered his stories with a volume and enthusiasm that carried more than words. Those who worked nearby recalled that Hackett's speech came with heat and moisture. His breath was warm, heavily worked, and persistent, carrying the unmistakable scent of cigarettes mixed with the damp sweetness of a mouth that never seemed to pause. As his excitement grew, so did the output. What began as proximity quickly became saturation. Under the studio lights, that moisture lingered. It didn't vanish between sentences. It hovered. The air around Hackett felt thick, faintly sour, and unsettled, as if conversation itself had altered the room's balance. Crew members later described the sensation as standing too close to a man who talked for a living and never stopped to breathe. For Johnny Carson, this was intolerable and unavoidable. He had a documented aversion to bodily fluids and unexpected physical intrusion. Yet he remained seated, shoulders squared, face relaxed. He adopted the posture the crew quietly named the Hackett lean, a careful angle that appeared engaged on camera while subtly reducing exposure. His laughter landed perfectly. His timing never slipped. His breathing became shallow and controlled. According to wardrobe staff, Hackett days required preparation. 2 identical suits were set aside for Carson before taping. His jacket received a clear, water-resistant treatment normally reserved for rainwear, altered to remain invisible under studio lighting. It wasn't cosmetic. It was defensive. The most extreme moment came during an especially animated story when Hackett leaned forward repeatedly, voice rising, breath accelerating. During a brief cutaway, Carson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he wiped moisture from near his eyes disguised as laughter. When the camera returned, the performance resumed without interruption. After the segment ended, Carson left the set immediately. A production assistant later recalled that he changed clothes and showered before returning for the next guest. From that point on, a fresh suit waited off stage whenever Hackett was booked. The crew began referring to the area within arm's length of Hackett as the splash radius. Towels were kept nearby. After certain appearances, the desk surface and guest chair were dried before filming could continue. Over time, repeated exposure wore through the couch's protective treatment, forcing it to be reupholstered. What stands out is not the mess, it is the restraint. Hackett continued to be invited back. Carson never addressed it publicly. He understood that comedy came with collateral damage. After one particularly heavy appearance, Carson reportedly leaned toward Ed McMahon and murmured, "I deserve hazard pay for that." The audience laughed at the line that followed, unaware that the danger had already passed and soaked into the room. Rip Taylor didn't just sweat under the studio lights, he cooked. Within minutes of sitting down, heat radiated from his body, and perspiration followed immediately. It spread across his skin, soaked into his clothes, and gathered faster than the fabric could release it. Movement accelerated everything. Laughter, gestures, sudden bursts of energy all pushed more moisture into the air. The smell arrived soon after. Not faint, not gradual. It was sharp and unmistakable, the sour, salty tang of sweat that had been trapped and reheated, layered with the dull chemical note of cologne applied after the fact. The fragrance didn't mask anything. It sealed it in, creating a dense, humid cloud that hung low around the couch. As Taylor spoke, the odor intensified. Under the lights, the warmth activated it further, turning the immediate space into something heavy and slightly metallic, the kind of smell that makes breathing conscious rather than automatic. A cameraman later described it as the moment the room stopped feeling clean. Johnny Carson registered it instantly. When Taylor extended his hand, Carson hesitated barely a heartbeat before shaking it. The contact was brief, but enough. His palm came away wet and warm. Beneath the desk, he wiped his hand carefully, then placed it back on the armrest, posture unchanged. As the interview progressed, Taylor's shirt darkened in expanding patches. The fabric clung to him, holding moisture and releasing heat. At one point, as Taylor leapt up to demonstrate a bit, droplets lifted into the air, briefly visible under the lights before settling again on the desk, the chair, the space between host and guest. Carson's face shifted into what the crew called his crisis mask. The smile remained fixed. The eyes drifted slightly, unfocused, as if he were concentrating on not reacting. During the commercial break, the reality could no longer be hidden. The guest chair was damp to the touch. The air smelled used. Production assistants rushed in with towels, blotting the seat, the backrest, even the floor nearby. Hand sanitizer was pressed into Carson's hand immediately. One assistant later recalled that the chair gave off heat for several minutes after Taylor stood up, as if the body had imprinted itself into the cushion. Taylor, for his part, seemed unaware. When offered blotting papers, he laughed it off. "This is just how I sparkle," he said cheerfully. The smell, however, lingered. Sweat warmed into fabric, fabric warmed into air. After the segment, Carson changed his jacket and requested distance for the remainder of the show. From that night on, the Taylor protocol became standard. A discreet liner on the guest chair, additional spacing, replacement clothing, always ready. Taylor's bookings quietly declined. Years later, a former NBC executive summarized it without drama. Johnny could handle chaos. He just couldn't sit inside a room that no longer smelled breathable. By the time Orson Welles reached the Tonight Show couch in the 1970s, he carried more than his reputation into the studio. He carried mass, heat, density. The moment he sat down, the space around him began to change. Welles was physically immense in his later years, layered in dark, heavy clothing, chosen to minimize his size. Under the studio lights, those layers trapped heat. Within minutes, perspiration surfaced and stayed. It did not bead and evaporate, it spread, soaked, and warmed. The air around him thickened, compressed by body heat and proximity. Crew members quietly referred to it as the Orson effect. According to a former set technician, the temperature near Welles measurably increased once he was seated. The warmth radiating from his body altered the immediate environment, turning the guest area into a pocket of dense, stale air. The smell followed, not sharp like alcohol, not sour like sweat alone. It was heavier, a deep, humid combination of heated fabric, skin, and exertion, intensified by limited movement and the inability to cool down between segments. As Welles spoke, gestured, and leaned forward, the odor expanded outward, slow and unavoidable. Johnny Carson felt it almost immediately. He respected Welles profoundly and made no attempt to embarrass him. But those watching closely noticed subtle adjustments. Carson angled his body slightly away while keeping his face turned toward his guest. His chair shifted back by inches over the course of the interview, not enough to be obvious on camera, but enough to create a fraction of relief. During commercial breaks, the set transformed into controlled urgency. Industrial fans were positioned just off camera and aimed directly at Welles the moment the lights dimmed. Makeup artists rushed in with specialized products designed for extreme perspiration. Towels were used sparingly, carefully, to avoid drawing attention. Despite these efforts, the situation deteriorated as the interview continued. By the final segment, Welles's clothing had visibly changed texture, saturated beyond recovery. The air felt heavy, used, and resistant, the kind that clings to the lungs. The most extreme incident occurred during a summer broadcast when the studio's air conditioning faltered. Within minutes, the heat intensified dramatically. Welles's perspiration spread visibly across his clothing, creating darkened patterns that expanded under the lights. During the break, Carson quietly moved his chair farther back, a rare breach of his precise positioning. When the segment ended, Welles required assistance to stand. The guest chair he left behind was thoroughly damp. According to a cleaning staff member, it was removed from the set and later replaced entirely. Not cleaned, replaced. What made the moment remarkable was Carson's restraint. He never complained publicly. He never reduced Welles to a spectacle. Later, he confided to a producer, "Some people are worth enduring discomfort for. Orson is one of them." Then, with a pause, he added, "Just make sure the fans are ready." Truman Capote's early appearances on The Tonight Show carried elegance. His later ones carried preparation. By the mid-1970s, bringing Capote on set required a level of advanced planning usually reserved for technical failures, not guests. The problem wasn't a single smell. It was conflict. Alcohol, old fabric, skin that hadn't rested, and layered on top too much cologne applied too late. Under the studio lights, those elements didn't blend, they fought. Makeup artists referred to it quietly as the Capote challenge. Extra powder was applied to absorb oil that surfaced within minutes. Concealer worked overtime to correct a grayish tone that the lights made worse. And finally, cologne strong, floral, persistent, was added in an attempt to control what couldn't be erased. It never worked. As Capote spoke, the warmth activated everything. The cologne bloomed first, sharp and sweet. Then the underlying notes surfaced: stale alcohol, fabric worn too long, the faint sourness of exhaustion. The result was a dense, confusing cloud that made distance feel necessary. Johnny Carson adjusted instinctively. He began interviews in his standard posture, then, segment by segment, increased the space between them, not abruptly, incrementally, enough that camera operators quietly compensated by tightening angles. One assistant later described the smell as cologne fighting something it couldn't defeat. Another said it made the air feel artificial, like an old dressing room sealed too long. During one appearance in the late 1970s, Capote arrived wearing what appeared to be the same jacket he'd worn days earlier. Despite wardrobe's efforts, faint traces of recent meals remained. Worse, the cologne had been reapplied multiple times without a reset in between, creating layers that intensified under heat. During the commercial break, Carson turned to Ed McMahon and whispered, "I think I'm being chemically attacked." He requested an identical jacket from his dressing room, convinced the scent had transferred. As the interview continued, Capote grew visibly unsteady. Perspiration joined the mix. The smell deepened, sour and sweet at once, heavy enough that Carson stood during a story, ostensibly to demonstrate a point, but long enough to breathe away from the source. The break was extended. Carson spent it offstage, inhaling deeply, resetting. After the segment, the guest chair was removed for deep cleaning. Carson followed his private routine. Jacket changed, mouthwash used, distance restored. Despite everything, Capote continued to be booked. Out of respect, out of history. But after difficult nights, the crew enacted what they called the Capote Recovery Protocol. The smell, they said, lingered long after the words faded. If every guest before him strained Johnny Carson's tolerance, Charles Bukowski shattered it. Bukowski did not arrive smelling unprepared. He arrived smelling intentional. When he entered the studio in 1975, the reaction was immediate and physical. Crew members stiffened. Makeup artists stopped mid-step. The air around him carried layers: old alcohol, unwashed fabric, skin that hadn't seen water in days, and something darker beneath it all. Not just odor, but decay in motion. Production notes were unusually blunt. Multiple layers of body odor, hair containing unknown residue, skin coated with a film resistant to standard cleansing products, breath strong enough to cause visible discomfort. Even veteran crew hardened by decades of Hollywood excess hesitated. Wardrobe refused direct contact. Bukowski's jacket was handled with hangers and improvised tools. One assistant quietly asked whether this qualified as a workplace hazard. Johnny Carson felt it before Bukowski reached the desk. During their pre-show greeting, Carson instinctively stepped back a fraction of a second, where professionalism failed before snapping back into place. His face passed through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, recoil, calculation, control. The interview itself became a test of endurance. Bukowski slumped into the chair, radiating heat as the studio lights activated what one audio technician later called the full aromatic release. The smell intensified quickly: warm alcohol turning sour, body odor blooming under heat, fabric holding and amplifying everything. Carson positioned himself at maximum distance while maintaining eye contact. He angled his body away, leaned subtly back, and altered his breathing shallow, controlled, mostly through the mouth. From the audience's perspective, it looked like attentive hosting. From the crew's, it looked like survival. During the first commercial break, Carson's assistant rushed in with a handkerchief treated with mentholated oil, a theatrical trick used when actors must perform near overwhelming smells. Johnny pressed it briefly to his face, swallowing hard. He was fighting nausea. By the second segment, the situation worsened. The heat lifted the odor further. A cameraman stationed nearby experienced involuntary eye-watering and had to be replaced. The air felt thick, contaminated, difficult to process. After the taping ended, Carson retreated to his dressing room and called his physician. The migraine that followed required prescription medication. He later described the experience not as unpleasant, but as a sensory assault. The guest chair became the subject of debate: clean or discard. In the end, it was removed from the set permanently, the only piece of furniture in the show's history to be decommissioned because of a guest. And yet, when asked later about Bukowski, Carson surprised everyone. "Sometimes greatness doesn't smell great," he said. "That's the price of authenticity." It was the final limit of what he would endure, and the clearest proof of how far he was willing to go for the sake of television. For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat inches away from chaos, not the kind audiences laughed at, but the kind that pressed into the air, clung to fabric, and tested the body's limits night after night. What viewers saw was composure, timing, effortless charm. What they never smelled was the price of live television. Behind the desk, Carson endured environments that would be unacceptable by today's standards: toxic smoke, saturated heat, bodies pushed beyond comfort and hygiene, carrying with them the residue of excess, exhaustion, and decline. He never recoiled on camera, never humiliated a guest, never broke the illusion. Instead, he adapted. He leaned back an inch. He angled his body. He altered his breathing. He endured. The stories whispered by crew members decades later don't diminish the guests who appeared on that couch. They humanize the space between greatness and decay, between genius and neglect, between brilliance and the physical reality that fame can no longer disguise. Carson understood something rare: that great television often requires sacrifice not of dignity, but of comfort. He absorbed what the audience never could, so the show could go on uninterrupted. And when the lights went down, the fans turned on, the chairs were cleaned or replaced, and the air slowly reset, the illusion remained intact. That may be Johnny Carson's most invisible achievement. Not what he said, but what he endured silently so millions could keep laughing.